Hi, welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. I'm Mike Selby, your guest host, and we're interviewing Keith Powell, who you might recognize because he's usually the host.
Thanks, Mike. Nice to be here.
Great, and we're talking about your new book, Abandoned Kootenays. This is your seventh book, isn't it?
Seventh book, yes. November was a busy month. 2 books came out. I didn't really intend to have 2 books come out at the same time, but as they went into production and printing and so forth, it just turned out that November was the time when they were both ready, so I released them at the same time. Number 1, I put out Kootenay Burning, which was a historical novel about the South Country, and the second book in November was Abandoned Kootenays, which is a collection of my images from throughout the East and West Kootenay, sort of historical images, but contemporary as well, as that I've gone out, taken these pictures probably in the last 6 to 10 years kind of thing.
Oh, wow. So it's different than you usually write historical novels, and Forgotten Cranbrook.
That's true.
Was a lot
a bit of a departure, all right, because you know, as you mentioned, I usually write historical novels. In this particular time, I have a whole bunch of images that I've collected and saved, and I had been featuring them on my Instagram page, which is Wild Horse Creek Press, and several people had said, you know, you've got a good selection of photos, why don't you think about doing a book? And I saw a similar publication in Alberta, and I thought, you know, this would lend itself to the Kootenays. So I took the idea, sat down and started to, you know, compile the images and see if I could come up with appropriate cut lines and stories that would go with each of the images. And by and large, I think it went together fairly well. People seem to be enjoying the book. It's sort of designed as a coffee table book. So.
Yeah, the photos are wonderful. They're mostly color, and it's not just here. You do the East and West Kootenays.
That's right. One of my favorite spots in the Kootenays is Sandon. So the ghost town of Sandon, all kinds of great things you can take a picture of that are abandoned there. So, of course, at one point in time, that Sandon probably had a population of over 5,000 people, and it was a thriving community. And there's remnants of that still there. And so that's the kind of thing I really like to explore. So Sandon's one of my favorites, as well as the Wild Horse, just north of Fort Steele. All those historic areas are rich in sort of what I call rusty relics and old buildings and things that sort of captivate my attention.
Yeah, one thing I noticed, there's a lot of vehicles in this.
Well, I do have a sort of a passion or interest in what I call rusty relics or old abandoned vehicles, because to tell you the truth, they have sort of a ambiance of their own, and it's sort of neat to sort of capture some of those images, because a lot of them are being towed away and recycled and whatever, but they do speak to a forgotten era. They speak to a time when these were important vehicles of commerce, really, as they represented many businesses throughout the Kootenays.
Another neat thing I noticed was phantom signs, I think you call them.
Yeah.
Signs on buildings that just about every city in the Kootenays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's you know, there's almost a subculture out there that a lot of people go out and try and find these phantom or ghost signs, and what they are literally is just signs that have been left over from businesses that are now defunct, gone out of business. And many of these signs that go back, you know, a decade or even 3 or 4 decades, were often hand-painted, beautifully crafted signs, and it's amazing what's under the siding of many of the commercial enterprises and businesses. But Nelson, for instance, Cranbrook, pretty well every community in the Kootenays, if you look hard enough, you can find a few phantom signs that are still existing. And again, they sort of speak to the history and the legacy of that community. And so I try and capture some of those as well.
I noticed one that I've noticed my entire life growing up here is beside the Armin Theatre. There's an Enjoy Pepsi hand-painted on the side.
Well, I talked to Ferdy Berlin. He's been busy trying to restore the Armin Theatre, and I told him, Ferdy, whatever you do, don't paint over the Pepsi sign.
That's great. How was it? Were you able to get on private property to get some of these?
Yeah, you know, that's always an issue, because more and more do not trespass signs are popping up everywhere. Yeah. In most cases, I was able to ask the owner and talk to them and just, you know, get their permission. In some cases where it was particularly remote, or you know, for something sitting out in a field or whatever, I would approach that subject and take the picture. So I always try and be respectful of private property,
Right, yeah.
and if at all possible, if I can track down who owns that property, I'll get permission before I shoot the picture. But you know what? There are so many of these abandoned treasures throughout the Kootenays, is that many of them are on public land or near
Right.
highways or thoroughways or whatever. So they're fairly accessible if you keep your eyes open.
One of the sad parts I noticed is some of the photos of buildings that they're not there currently in 2023. They've either been burnt down by arsonists or destroyed by the owner. One example was the Western town beside the Rex Drive-In.
Interesting story behind that, Mike, for sure. Rex Colmer owned the Rex Theater, and I think he had a vision of building a Western village, and he actually did build it. Though I think you and I talked about the fact whether he ever actually put it into use or play, I'm not sure. But it sat there for many years. In fact, J-Bar J Western Wear was owned by Jay Savage, and it was a commercial outlet for many years. He had a store there, a retail store. Then it was basically left empty for probably a decade or more. And always caught my attention as I drove down Theater Road, this little Western village sitting off in the back. One day I did take photos of it, and sadly enough, it's disappeared. It got demolished recently. Again, sort of a legacy or part of our history that does disappear. And there's another example of that, Jordan's Cabin, that's on Kootenay Pass. So. This beautiful log structure sat beside the road, and many people probably saw it because they had a little sign there that said Jordan's Cabin, a plaque. Interestingly enough, the individual that owned the place is buried in behind, so there's a little cemetery.
Oh, wow.
The cemetery continues to exist, and so it's worth a stop if you're going by and just to check that out. But it really broke my heart when that structure was burnt down. Someone deliberately set fire to it, and all that's left is a pile of ashes. It's a part of our history, and an important part of our history that sort of slipped through our fingers.
Right, and there's a brick structure by the Moyer Cemetery.
Yeah, again, that's the one thing I like about the project and these images that I'm able to capture is that they all have a story to them, and it speaks to the history and the legacy of the Kootenays. That building you talk about at the forts or at the Moyer Cemetery. In my understanding, at one point in time, the St. Eugene mine was the biggest mine in BC, and the population of Moyer was pushing 3,000 people, and it was really the birthplace. There's a start of Cominco, or the company that eventually developed Kimberley and the Sullivan mine, and so forth. But that little brick structure that had the beautiful archway next to the cemetery in Moyer was known as the Powder House, and so that's where they stored the dynamite that they used in the mines. So it was well built and a beautiful little structure. Unfortunately, that beautiful stone arch, the work, it has since fallen down. So again, part of our history sort of slipping away.
Right, and a lot of old industrial places like Wycliffe or Lumberton where the area really got started.
Yeah, and it speaks to the fact that many of these enterprises and industries, had a major impact on the Kootenays, and they were the lifeblood of many of these small communities. You look at Wardner, you look at Lumberton, you look at some of the other small communities. These structures, they're just a skeleton left. Hosmer, the same thing. But if you wander through the bush, you see a concrete skeleton of what was once a very thriving business or industry. At one point in time, the sawmill at Wycliffe, the Otis Staples sawmill, I think employed close to 600 people.
Wow.
And so it was a big operation. Similarly, the Crow's Nest Enterprises out in Wardner, probably 200-300 people worked there. So, that was the lifeblood of the community. It sustained and supported the community. And I sort of like to try and remember that legacy, just even if you just capture the skeleton of what is there now.
Right, because it's disappearing, and some of these photos really capture. Did you have a favorite area of the Kootenays?
Well, there are a couple of areas I really enjoy researching, and one of them is the Wild Horse. And just north of Fort Steele, that valley has so much history. and it's got a little cemetery there, which is very picturesque. As you walk down to the creek itself, Wild Horse, there's a number of artifacts that are still there, and they're easily accessible, and you're able to go right down and look at some of the mining operation and some of the things that are left over
Right.
from over 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago. But Wild Horse has got also Tommy Walker's grave, which sort of fascinates me. It's it was one of the original gunfights in the Kootenays, and unfortunately Tommy Walker died, Thomas Walker, but they have a nice memorial to him right along the trail in the Wild Horse, and it's always I always like to stop there and just think about, he's got an interesting story as well, because through my research, I sort of figured out that no one ever knew what happened to him, including his family. And in fact, his father evidently came over to North America. He died in 1864 when the gold rush was on in the Wild Horse. His father came over and spent years and years looking for his son, never to find him. And so I know that some enterprising historians out of Fort Steele at one point in time made a trip back to his hometown in Ireland, and they were able to inform the descendants of what had happened and so forth, and made that linkage. So quite a story.
That's a big story. And it's wonderful that it's still kept up, his grave.
Attached to it. Yeah, so that's one of my favorite places. The other one I mentioned was Sandon. I love the West Kootenays. The West Kootenays has got lots of intriguing spots. And the other place I really enjoy visiting is Harrod Proctor. And of course, that's across the west arm of Kootenay Lake. And I always say, when you take that little cable ferry across and step off, it feels like you're going back to 1950. It's it's a quiet area. And very isolated to some degree, though there is development happening there like everywhere else. But it has that hometown, small town feel to it, and I love exploring some classic old barns that are sitting in the Harrod Proctor area that make for great photos.
Yeah, you have wonderful photos of all these really historic, and there's a story on each photo. There's a nice story that you've written.
Yeah, that's what I tried to do, is to sort of enhance the image by telling a little bit of the background and what was some of the history that was pertaining to that. The other passion that, I like rusty relics, which are the old cars and trucks. I like the phantom signs. I like old buildings, but I also keep my eye open for old barns as well. So again, the Kootenays has lots of old barns, and what got me onto old barns, if you remember, Mike, when you went out to the Cranbrook Airport, on the right-hand side, there was a beautiful barn that stood there for years and years and years. And one day I traveled out to the airport, and it either had been taken down or fell down, I'm not sure which, but it was gone. And I always kicked myself that I never stopped and took a picture of that barn. It was a beautiful old barn. So which sort of prompted me to keep my eyes open for old structures like that and sort of document them. And that's part of the rationale is that I think I've created a pretty good inventory of a lot of those old buildings that may be slipping away or gone. And oftentimes when I stop and ask a rancher or a farmer if I can take a picture of their barn, they sort of look at me like, what? But then I say, I'm trying to inventory or trying to make a list or an archive of all the old structures in the area. And they're very receptive to the idea by and large.
Yeah, there are a lot of signposts for myself and others older than me growing up in the Kootenays that you've seen all your life, and then it's gone one day.
That's right, yeah. They just disappear.
Yeah, and you don't think about it.
That's right.
As you drive by.
Well, and I guess it goes hand in hand with my interest in history and local history. So I think you alluded to it in the beginning. I've put out two sort of historical photo books along with the Columbia Institute of Regional History. And the first one being Forgotten Cranbrook, which was 120 pages of historical images of early Cranbrook. And people just really appreciated that, and tremendous comments, good feedback on that. Now recently I've put out Forgotten Kimberley, which is sort of a companion book to that. And again, people just love the nostalgia of those images. It takes them back to maybe a simpler time, or a time that they can remember when they were young, and they do relate to it, which then sort of translates into Abandoned Kootenays, which captures that sort of another aspect of local history or the local legacy of the Kootenays.
Right, I can see how they fit together. Here's the way it used to be, and here's what's left now that's still around.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. Well, thank you, Keith. Abandoned Kootenays is available most places, I believe.
Yeah, no, I've been really trying to distribute it throughout the Kootenays. And, it's given me a little bit of additional exposure in the fact that I'm hearing from bookstores that I haven't dealt with in the past, which is really nice to see. For instance, I have multiple orders out of Trail. The Trail bookstore has been selling Abandoned Kootenays like crazy, so hats off to them. And it just, when you're a local author, self-published, any exposure that you can get with your books and opportunity to work with the local book market is really a privilege, and it's been a real privilege for my take on things, to be able to work closely with the local booksellers and libraries and that kind of thing, as people seem to enjoy a focus on the Kootenays. And that's one thing I always try and point out, is there's just not enough information about the Kootenays.
Right.
There's a few historical books that are really valuable and tell the story, but I think in comparison to many areas, the stories of the Kootenays hasn't been told, and I've tried to document that both through my historical novels and also through the collection of photo books that I put out.
Yeah, and you've done a great job, because there's a rich history in this area.
And great characters too.
Yeah, really a lot of colorful people. Yeah. And as a librarian, I'd say your books are always being requested by lots and lots of people. Everyone enjoys when your books come out.
Well, that's good. Good to hear that.
Yeah. So thank you for watching Talking Kootenay Books. I'm Mike Selby, and this is Keith Powell.